We're now going to look at solving quadratic equations by the square root property. That's what I like to call it, the square root property. So this is one of the ways that we can solve quadratic equations. And as it turns out, this is probably the easiest way to solve a quadratic equation. It doesn't always work, but if it's possible to use the square root property, then by all means, it makes it easiest. So let me first give you some examples of equations where we can use the square root property, and later on we'll actually solve them, and let me show you some equations that we can't, so you know the difference. The whole idea of the square root property is you have some kind of equation, and you simply are going to take the square root of both sides, and by doing that, you end up with a linear equation which you can solve. And oftentimes you end up with the solution right away after you take the square root of both sides. So for example, let me just do a few examples. What if you were given x squared equals 169? Actually, since I don't have my calculator, let's make it something that I can be for sure that I know the answer to. X squared equals 49. Anytime you have an equation with only the variable squared, and the variable is not in any other part of the equation, you can always use the square root property. So you simply take the square root of both sides. Square root of x squared is just x. Square root of 149, now don't forget, it's not going to be just 7, it's going to be plus and minus 7. Because once again, square root says what number multiplied by itself would equal 49, and that's true for 7 and negative 7. So there are actually two solutions. So you see, this was very easy to solve. Just for fun, I'm going to go off to the side very quickly. Here was this original problem. Someone might have tried to solve this problem by factoring, which means you get everything on the same side, and then you factor. This is a difference of squares. So x minus 7 times x plus 7 equals 0. Now you look at your two parentheses and you realize the two solutions are 7 and negative 7, which is the same we got earlier. But I think the square root property is a much easier way to do it. Another example. One little twist to this one. But still not too difficult. In this case, I'm going to go and get the x squared by itself. You don't have to do that, but I like to. So I'll divide both sides by 25. And now I see I only have one term with the x in it, and it's x squared. And I realize I can use the square root property. If I take the square root of both sides, then I have x equals, now the square root of 9 is 3, square root of 25 is 5, so it's plus or minus 3/5. One more example, a little twist. X minus 3 squared equals 17. So now we don't just have the variable by itself squared, but the x is inside of a parenthesis. This is actually a binomial, and the whole binomial is squared. But you notice that if you go ahead and take the square root of both sides, Once again, when you take the square root of something squared, even if it's a parenthesis squared, you end up with whatever is under the radical. And then over here, square root of 17, I cannot simplify, so I just simply write plus or minus square root of 17. Now if I'm going to solve for x, I need to get x by itself, so now I can add 3 to both sides. And the solution will be 3 plus or minus square root of 17. Now let me show you an example of a quadratic equation where you cannot use the square root property. And it's really very simple. You notice here, I have x squared, but then I have another term with x. The square root property says you take the square root of both sides. But you notice here, I can't really take the square root of x squared plus 5x plus 6. Even if I moved some stuff to the other side and then tried to take the square root, I still cannot do this. So the whole key for the square root property is to recognize your equation at first. If you simply have the x squared, and that's the only term in the equation with an x, you can use the square root property. And even sometimes, if you have your x inside parentheses and the parentheses squared, you can also use the square root property. So, square root property is not very hard to use and comes in very handy.